we'll have two poll questions that you need to participate in if you're gonna ask for credit to get the certificate. So we'll talk about that towards the end. And so we'll start off talking about the letter of map amendment, which is the LOMA, and then we'll move on to the letters of map revision based on fill, or the LOMR-F, in the second part. So these are the forms that we would use for a LOMA. So we have the MT1 form. So that's the one you see in front, and then behind that we have the MTEZ. So either one can be used for a single lot or structure that's not in the floodway. That's basically what the MTEZ form is for, just to make it easy if it's a very simple LOMA. If it is in the floodway or it's a commercial property or there's multiple lots or structures, then it would be the MT1 form. Okay. So yeah, just residential structures on the MTEZ. And so this is the current form. It did expire back in 2014 and they have not updated it. So basically it says these forms can be used until further notice, and then just, yeah, use these forms to complete your application. And so if you do have these saved on your computer like I do, you should probably go to the website and just check periodically to make sure that they haven't updated it, because as soon as they do, we have to start using the new forms unless there's some kind of specific grace period, like with the elevation certificate. So I'll also be sending out an announcement if they ever do update these. So it's just something to be aware of. They are a bit out of date. Okay. So the first part of the MTEZ form is just to check. The first question, has fill been placed on the property to raise the ground that was previously below the base flood elevation, and if so, stop. So this is just to let people know that if you're applying for something that's been elevated on fill, that you're on the wrong form and you need to go use the MT1, and then that is what the LOMR-F is for. So a LOMA is only for natural grade. So it can have been elevated on anything, it's just naturally above the floodplain, and it has been inadvertently mapped into the floodplain just because of complications with scale. So things do get mapped into the floodplain that shouldn't be, and so this is kind of a correction to that. So this doesn't officially change the maps or anything, but it will be a legal letter saying that your either property or structure is out of the floodplain officially. So if you don't officially take it out and go through this application process, it's still technically in the floodplain. Some people think even if they have like the survey or the elevation certificate that proves that, that they're officially outside of it, but you're not until you have something like this if you are mapped in. Sometimes it's just close to the property, and there's a different process for that that we'll talk about towards the end of this first part. And another thing to note is that fill that's been put in place before the area was mapped can be considered natural grade. So before the first flood map, so you might have to look at aerial photographs or have some other type of documentation that would prove that it was in place before that point in time. If there's a construction date or something like that, then it can be considered natural grade. But that's not usually the case. We're mostly just talking about natural grade. So then they want the legal description of the property and the street address if it has one. Sometimes rural areas don't have street addresses, or if it's a new area that doesn't have the like NG 911 address yet. The other information here, the legal description, the lot and block subdivision description, that can usually be found with the deed, or like a parcel search. You can find that information. You just want to make sure that it's fully correct. And so I'm kind of talking about the perspective, I guess, of the surveyor or the floodplain administrator. So the floodplain administrator may or may not be part of this process. If it's the MTEZ, your signature isn't needed, so it might happen outside of that, which is fine. Because FEMA receives these, they review them and make sure that all of that information is correct, and they may work outside of the actual community officials. For the MT1, that's not the case, so we will discuss that more. But you'll probably get a lot of questions as the floodplain administrator about LOMAs. So kind of talking about both sides of that. And then, are you requesting that a flood zone determination be completed for what? It could be just a structure, it could be a portion of a legally recorded property, or the entire property, as long as whichever one you're doing, the lowest lot elevation is at or above the base flood elevation. And then for a structure, it's making sure that the lowest adjacent grade is at or above the base flood elevation. So that is also a little bit different than our state minimum standard, which includes freeboard. So if it's built in compliance and everything, that's a little bit separate. That's like a state requirement for new construction. For FEMA, we're talking about minimum standards, so that's being at or above the base flood elevation. Okay. So the next part is just the applicant's information. So their name, email address. So FEMA has been pushing to move to electronic. So yes, you should have that in there so that they can get a hold of you and fix a problem. If there's anything missing or if there's any clarifications, they'll reach out to you. I know there are some surveyors that insist on doing things on paper and through the postal mail, which is okay, but it does cost an extra $100, even though LOMAs are free most of the time. If you choose to do it that way, it's $100, and then it's much slower communication. So we're trying to go digital. It's a lot faster. There's a whole submission portal that makes it a lot easier. Okay. But yeah, basically just that information, pretty straightforward. The next part, so the checkbox will depend on if we're talking about a structure, and then we're talking about the lowest adjacent grade. So it says that the lowest ground that's touching the structure, which would include patios, decks, or stairs that support it. So if that is structurally attached to that structure, then it would have to also be at or above the base flood elevation. If we're talking about the legal recorded parcel of land or the full property, then again, the lowest lot elevation of that portion or property would have to be at or above the base flood elevation. So they want to know what you are applying for, and then again, the property description is there. Under that, the street address, and then what type of construction. They want to know what kind of foundation it has. So crawl space, slab on grade, or basement, or other. Explain, sometimes there's like mixed foundation types. And then after that, the latitude and longitude. So they are asking for the 5th decimal place on this. So if you only put 4, that would be counted as an error. And on newer forms, they're asking for 6 decimal places. So this one's still, like I said, a little bit outdated. But then they have that for the structure or the property. So then the next part is the flood insurance rate map information. So this information is very similar to filling out an elevation certificate. And in fact, if you already have one for a structure, then that can be used instead or as an attachment. Especially if you're using the MT1 application, you can use that instead of the elevation form. So the NFIP community number is a unique 6-digit number for every community, and then the map and panel number are also unique to that particular panel. So this is where we would go to the map on the, well, there's several different ways to access it, and we'll look at those. And then you have the base flood elevation, which has to be calculated, and then the source of that base flood elevation. And then just one other thing to point out, they ask if has FEMA identified this area as subject to land subsidence or uplift? We do have a few areas like that identified in Cherokee and Reno counties that are due to mining in the past. So if you're working in either of those areas, you might need to check that. I also wanted to point out that there are detailed step-by-step instructions available. So these are actually more updated. They're from 2021, and you can find them pretty easily. You can type in MTEZ or FEMA LOMA application, and then it should pull up the form and the instructions. So these were probably updated at the same time that they were putting out risk grading 2.0, so they could update some of that information about the mandatory purchase requirement, and maybe the old ones had some outdated stuff on it. So these are available and very helpful. They go through how to calculate stuff in different zones. So for example, I wasn't sure how they would do an AO zone, and yeah, it's usually flood depth, and then looking at the instructions, it talks about how to calculate that. So you're taking like nearby flooding areas and then adding the depth to it. So just an example of stuff that they have in there. So this is the NFIP community map and panel number. So this is the title block that you would see if you pulled up the panel in the map service center. So that's where all of the effective products from FEMA are stored. So I'll show you that in a second, but if you go to the title block, which is usually in the lower right-hand corner, it will tell you the effective dates and then the full map and panel numbers. So your community number is there. Like I said, it's a 6-digit number that's unique to the community. So we're looking at Shawnee County in this case, and the city of Topeka in Shawnee County. So it gives you both. And then the full map and panel number is the 20177, and then C is for countywide 0193, and then E is the suffix. So they want the full number. Don't leave anything out. If you see where it says 193 out of 450, that is an abbreviation, so don't use that. They want the full map and panel number. Okay. So then the base flood elevation, like I said, it has to be calculated, and there's a couple different ways to do that. We'll talk about it, but it's going to depend on what the zone is. So for zone A, there would definitely be a few different ways of doing that because there's best available data. For all other zones, it would have to be the effective data, and then you calculate that either using the flood insurance study, or if it's for the flood insurance study stream profiles, or if it's like a lacustrine area, it would be the still water surface elevation tables. And like I said, the instructions have a full description of how these should be calculated. And then of course, FEMA is going to review it and make sure that they agree with that determination. And then the source of that base flood elevation. So usually the flood insurance study, it could be us at the state if we calculated it for you. That will just depend. So we'll take a look at that, and then so you have the lowest adjacent grade for the structure. So that's what they're going to compare it to make sure it's at or above that elevation. And then under that, if we're talking about a section of property, then that's lowest lot elevation, and then of course the datum. So you want to make sure the datums match up. The older maps, some of them still have the NAVD 88, so that might need to be converted. And then they want you to attach that conversion. The newer ones are NGVD 29, so there's that. Okay. So this is the Map Service Center. So you can just type in FEMA MSC or just Map Service Center, and it should pull right up. And then this is basically the place where you can find all of your effective products. You can find preliminary products. You can find your historical products are all here. So if you just want to type in an address really quickly for a place that has a digital map, they don't have the paper maps available through that, but that's the National Flood Hazard Layer. And you can make the fermet, so that's one of the attachments that they ask for the LOMAs, so you can do that there quickly and easily. Otherwise, you would go to search all products and then you find it that way. So we'll look through these. There's a couple of different ways, like I said. So if I use the search bar to just type in an address, so that is our office address in Topeka. So you can see where it's pulled up. It will just show you the map. You can see the pretty detailed floodplain areas. So they put a lot of those features on there. The full map and panel numbers there, the effective dates there, the community boundaries and labels, and the full community number is there. So that's the 6-digit number after it says City of Topeka. So if you want to make a ferment this way, you just click on the dynamic map that's in the middle of the screen, and then it will just generate this for you. So this is a ferment. It says that at the top. So this will give you all of the same firm information that you would find in the other couple of ways that we'll look at. So again, this is a National Flood Hazard Layer, so it's basically FEMA's GIS viewer. So you can pull this up. They do have like a full website version of this as well that you could use and probably generate a ferment in there as well. But this has all of that information that they would be asking for. So if you can't do that, or if you need something else like the flood insurance study, you would go to the search all products option, and then you just go by state, and then what county, and then what community in that county, and then search it. And then it will pull up, like I said, all of those products, effective, preliminary, and historical. So under effective products, they have the firm panels. They would also have things like your revalidation letters for your letters of map change. You can see all of the effective letters of map change in there, and your effective flood insurance study. So I've opened up the firm panels tab in this screenshot, and you can see all of the panels there. So you just find the appropriate one. You might need to open the index to find that. So the index is kind of like a map of all of the panels and where they're located, so you can find which panel you're looking for if you still have paper maps and you can't find it digitally, or using the search bar. So you just find your appropriate panel, and then sorry, this is the index map. So this is an older one that we had for Lawrence. This has since been updated, but it shows you, again, where all the panels are, and then some of those larger landmarks to help you navigate what you're looking at. So this is helpful if you still have paper maps to find the appropriate panel. And it's good for like preliminary products as well. So this is what the panel looks like, one of the newer ones. So if you open it up fully, this is the full panel that you're looking at. So this is where you would start the ferment. You can create a ferment this way, and it's just a little bit different mapping style. So you can see how this is a little bit different from the National Flood Hazard Layer. They have probably a different aerial photo background, and then it's not that same color scheme. It's just kind of blue and black and white. So if you hit the create a ferment, you pick your page size, and then you hit next, and then you can drag and drop that green box over your area of interest, and then next the scale and north arrow box. So you can see where that is over the title block. So that will light up, and you can adjust those two things. And then once you're happy with that, you can preview it and then download it. So PDF or PNG file, PDF works better most of the time for what we use it for. And then save. So this is useful not just for letters of map change, but also for permitting and things like that that you might want to create a ferment and just keep that information handy with your permit files and things like that, so you can see it. And then this is what it looks like up close. So it still has all of that same information that we saw in the other one. It has a little bit less. It doesn't have the full legend of all the zones, but it's basically the same thing. It functions just the same. So you can see the floodplain here. It's in blue, so anything within that boundary would be in the floodplain, and then the same thing with the floodway. So the national flood hazard layer is colored so that it helps those with color blindness. Anyways, so this is the same thing here, and then the base flood elevation. So if we're talking about a detailed study area like this one, we're using the flood insurance study. That's what we have to use to calculate that for the effective base flood elevation. And so sometimes people will pull the numbers off of this where you can see like 1279 and 1277. So those numbers on this map are rounded. They're just to give you an idea of approximately what the base flood elevation is in that area, but it actually has to be calculated. And so that is a common mistake that we see, in permitting or elevation certificates or probably LOMAs. Although in the case of a LOMA, FEMA is reviewing that work and will, reach out to them to get a proper calculation and make sure that they agree with it. So there's less opportunity for things to slip through the cracks. And then this one is, in these screenshots, we have like an actual printout of the map, which is fine. It can be done this way. We also have our effective viewer, so it can be pulled into a GIS system, and then you can use the measurement tools in there. Our effective viewer also has measurement tools just in that on our website. So it can be done digitally. This example just happens to be on paper. If you do paper maps and you need to do it this way, you just want to make sure that you don't distort anything. So make sure that you print to actual size, so that way you avoid those mistakes. So I think we are still going to have a base flood elevation training at some point. And so we have that. We also have other examples on our recorded training where our mapping team goes through that process. So it's pretty straightforward if you're using the flood insurance study. Basically what you do is you find the location. So that's the black X on this example. So you would just mark where that location is in the floodplain, and then you measure basically its relationship to the stream channel and its bounding cross sections, and then based on where it is in proximity to those cross sections, you would find that on the profile, and then yeah, so in this case, he's measuring the distance between the cross sections, so we're just interpolating change over distance, basically. It's not super complicated. All the hard engineering has already been done to create the maps, so we're just kind of doing it in a graphical way to find our location in proximity to those cross sections and the base flood elevations that they represent. So this is an engineering scale, so he's measuring the distance between the two cross sections and then comparing that to the distance to the upstream cross section. So we're always looking at what the highest base flood elevation is that would impact that property, and making sure that that's the base flood elevation that we use, and that either that property or that structure is at or above that elevation to make sure that it is actually outside the floodplain. And so that's what we're doing in this process. It's pretty much just a ratio. So in the example, you can see he's the distance in relationship to those cross sections, he's put that on the profile, and then based on that location, you just go all the way straight up. And the stream profiles show you the stream bed, and then it has those diagonal lines are the different flood frequencies. So you just go to the 100-year flood, and then wherever that intersection is, you just go straight across and it tells you the base flood elevation. And so again, this can be done digitally. There is a little bit of like, I guess, a judgment call. It's not super precise. People can do, like, you can have two people do this and they could be like a tenth or so off, but it should be about the same however you do it. And again, FEMA is going to have to calculate it and look at your work and make sure that they agree before they approve the LOMA. So just an example of that here. This is the data table. So this will show you, this is just handy to look at anyways. So in the flood insurance study, it will tell you for the flooding source, those different cross sections that they have, and then it'll tell you the regulatory height of those cross sections. So that's what the base flood elevation is for the 100-year flood, which is of course our national standard. So that's just nice to know. And then of course your base flood elevation should be some number in between those two numbers. So if you get something outside of that range, you've definitely made a mistake. So this is a good way to check that. And then again, this is an example of an elevation certificate, but the rounded base flood elevation was used in this example. So in that case, if you did that, the LOMA wouldn't be approved, or they're going to reach out and ask for more information or to recalculate that. So you can't do that. It has to be within 1/10 of a foot. That's the standard. So this is a really great tool that we have available. The Kansas BFE portal, if you just type that in, you should be able to pull it up. And so basically we have this site available for surveyors or floodplain administrators or just the public to use. So you would just register for an account, and then you can go through and look at LiDAR. So I often give this to floodplain administrators who ask about a certain property, or property owners who call me. If they're asking like, can I get a LOMA? And I'm like, well, you know, you need a survey to determine that to know for sure, but this is a good tool that you can use. If you go to the map tab, you can pull up an address, and then you can just kind of click around the outside of a structure or around a property, and it will give you the approximate LiDAR value. And then you can see approximately what the ground elevation is, and you can look at all the floodplain data that's in there. And so you can see approximately what your elevation is that you're looking at in comparison to the base flood elevation, and it will be a good indicator as to whether or not that person or that structure or that property is a good candidate for a LOMA, because there's no point in attempting it to get the survey, which can be expensive depending on where you are. It'll vary, but those are expensive. So you want to get a good idea, is it even worth trying to get a LOMA and paying for the surveys? So this is something that I give out to property owners. It might be helpful for you to give out to property owners. And then of course you can request an official base flood elevation letter from us to be calculated if it's in A zone, or zone A, sorry. So if it's in an approximate floodplain, which is the A zone, we can calculate that for you. Detailed studies, you need to consult the FIS, and so that's what the legend looks like in that case. There's kind of like that grid symbolism for the detailed study areas where you would use the flood insurance study. And so basically you just draw a polygon as best you can over the area that you need calculated. You want to be as precise as possible if you're doing a structure or if it's a larger section of property. We'll calculate again, the highest base flood elevation that could impact what you've drawn. So sometimes we have to reach out and get people to redraw it or get clarification on what the request is for, just to make sure that we're doing it appropriately and calculating it the best that we can. So once you draw it, a little pop-up box will show you, your username and all of that, and then it will ask you what the purpose of the request is. So you could be requesting for a LOMA or a new construction or informational purposes, and then we'll just try to serve you the best that we can. Again, sometimes we reach out for clarifications, but this is a really great tool for people in Kansas. So. And this is a sample of what the letter looks like. It tells you how we calculated it, the current panel, and gives you that information. So, and then that's just kind of a close-up on that language. So, as I said, this kind of ties into flood insurance. So it used to be if you got a LOMA, you would officially come out of the floodplain, so you had the preferred risk policy available, so it was just a lot cheaper policy. FEMA did away with that when they released Risk Rating 2.0, so they're taking in all this other data to determine your insurance rate. And so we can't really see what all's going into that. People just have to work with their insurance agent. So it used to be just the base flood elevation compared to your floor elevation and the characteristics of your building. So you would have to get a surveyor to do an elevation certificate, and then you'd need all of that to get an insurance policy, but we would be able to tell people what their insurance rate would be like. So that's no longer the case. Having a LOMA is not going to help your rate anymore. It will take away the mandatory purchase requirement if that's what you were trying to accomplish. And of course, it takes you out of the floodplain, so you don't have to comply with those regulations anymore. But most people are doing it for insurance purposes, just to get out of the mandatory purchase requirement, which kicks in if you have a federal loan or federally backed mortgage in the floodplain. And so that's the main driver that I've been seeing since we had Risk Rating 2.0, which again was released in 2021. Although lenders can require you to have a flood insurance policy regardless of a LOMA or your flood zone. So that's just a little background on that. And then there's discounts available to people. If they're asking you about insurance, there's definitely some discounts that they might be eligible for. So just a little side note on that. As for the BFE portal, we do have statewide LIDAR and base level engineering. So we do have that data available. And then these are the people that you'd want to reach out to if you have mapping questions. I'm more on the rules and regulations side. So that Joanna and Bill are our mapping coordinator and specialist. So they can help you if you have questions about that. We also have like those data files available through the BFE portal if you are doing a model request. So that's also a feature in there. And then just a little bit, so we don't have to go into all of this. I just, this is a statewide effort that we had to provide that information so that people can get flood risk information where they don't have maps, and that's mostly Western Kansas. So that's why that's in here. Engineering initiative. And so you saw that map in the portal. You can see where all of that's available. So yeah, and then these are our ongoing mapping projects. So this one's a little bit out of date. We have been moving forward with all of these mapping projects. So if you are curious about that, we do have that on our site. And then this is our effective floodplain viewer. So this is also a really great resource. The the national flood hazard layer often is very slow, especially in the middle of the day. So I prefer to use this, our effective viewer. You can find it on our website, and you should be able to just search for it, but it's just for the state of Kansas. And we have all of the effective data in there. And then you can turn on different layers, so you can get the full map and panel number this way. You can create a fermet through our viewer. You can see on the left side there is drawing and measurement tools available, so that's helpful. Again, you can measure things digitally, which is mostly what's being done now. So this is what it looks like if you create a fermet basically through our viewer. So each style is a little bit different, but it still has that information on it. So, and I also wanted to show this one because we have the cross sections that were used to map the A zones in there. And the National Flood Hazard Layer doesn't have that, so we have more information that's, again, specific to Kansas available in the viewer. So this can be used to help with calculating a base flood elevation in the A zones. Again, the portal, you can use the portal for that. Okay. So just a side note here that if there are two elevations that overlap, you would have to calculate two of them, or like a confluence. If there's two different flooding sources, you would calculate both base flood elevations and then take the higher one. So again, it has to be the highest base flood elevation that could impact that property or that structure for the LOMA to be approved. And then again, FEMA is going to check that. So again, we have new areas that are mapped every year. You know, there's constantly ongoing projects, so you can see in the green where those counties are that have effective digital firms. Same thing here, just more of our current mapping stuff. So you can find all of these on our website, the up-to-date ones. So back to this, the lowest adjacent grade. Again, that's where the structure, the lowest place where the ground is touching the foundation of the structure. So if it's at or above the base flood elevation, you can get a LOMA, or that's the meets and bounds legal description of the portion of property. There is a concept called intervening higher grade. So in Kansas, there are a lot of structures that have basements. If it's built on natural grade, you might be able to get a LOMA by showing the intervening higher grade that would prevent the inundation of the building. So in a building like this with the classic basement and the window wells, the lowest adjacent grade is at the bottom of the window well. And so you have the potential intervening higher ground around that area. And so FEMA may consider that again, if it's on natural grade. I've also been told even if it's on natural grade that it needs to be dirt and not covered in concrete. So that might come into consideration. And sometimes it just depends on who's doing the reviewing at FEMA. They're not always completely consistent in how they do things, but so yeah. And then in the bottom example with the ramp, you have the potential intervening higher grade there. Again, the lowest adjacent grade would be at the bottom of that ramp. And in that case, it's covered in concrete, so it's just kind of a toss-up whether or not FEMA will consider it, even if it is on natural grade. So yeah, just some real life examples of that with the window wells. It doesn't really matter if there's a cover over the window well. FEMA's not going to consider that. And then this is a sketch that was used to prove the intervening higher grade. So this was for a LOMA application that was approved. So you have a structure with a basement, and then the intervening higher grade around that area. So he drew it out to show where the lowest adjacent grade is and all of that. So the more information that you can give them, the better chance you have of, getting it approved if you can prove that. So we have lots of detail here. Everything was clear, and showing how the water's not going to reach the bottom of that window well. So it doesn't work for a LOMR-F, really. So this is the documentation that they ask for. So they want you to provide them copies of this, not the original documents, but they want copies of the effective firm panel. So that's where the firmat would come in, either a copy of the subdivision plat map with the recorder's stamp on it, or a copy of the property deed, depending on what you're applying for. And then just making sure that you have map scale and north arrows on those maps. So pretty straightforward on the MTEZ. Yep. So you might, if there's not a firm for your community, you might need other local mapping. So the instructions kind of detail that, what kind of mapping you might need in an area without that. So yep, firm panels. And then again, this is the National Flood Hazard layer with the different coloring scheme. They're the same thing, basically. So here is another situation that we run into a lot, where the person's lender has used a third-party determination company and has determined that they are in the floodplain when it's actually just on the property in the backyard or somewhere close by. If there's any overlap with the property, sometimes they will just flag it as in, and then 6 months after the new maps come out, they get a letter saying that they have to have flood insurance, even though they're outside of the floodplain. So with this situation, they can get a LOMA out as shown, or OAS, without needing a survey. So a property owner can do this themselves. And I often send people these instructions. So that's why it's called out as shown. So you provide a map that shows where the floodplain is in relationship to your structure. So if your structure is not touched by the floodplain, it's considered out. If any part of the floodplain touches the structure, it doesn't have to fully cover it, but it would be considered to be in. So it's just kind of an all or nothing on that. But if it's not, we can show that it's out. And there's more detailed instructions on this online as well. So yeah, you fill out the entire MTEZ form, and then again you send a copy of the deed, a firmat, and then like I said, like the subdivision or the plat map, like the other checklist has on the MTEZ. So this is the full instructions. It goes through step by step how to do this. So yeah, and that way people can do this without having to buy or pay for the survey to be done, since they're not really in the floodplain. And then again, LOMAs are free because it's a correction to something that was inadvertently mapped in and should not have been. So yep. Again, if there's no firm coverage, you might be able to use BLE or local mapping resources. The instructions for the MT1 has a lot more detail on that. And again, if you already have an elevation certificate, that can be used so that you wouldn't have to redo the survey for a structure to get a structure out. Of course, it would be different for a full property or a section of property. And then again, online is better. So there's a whole online submission portal that surveyors use to send off the application with all of the attachments. Yeah, postal mail, they are basically asking not to do that anymore. Again, a LOMA does not mean that your structure cannot be flooded. So we try to tell people this all the time. Just because you have a LOMA, It doesn't mean you're safe from flooding. In fact, a lot of those structures would be in the moderate risk areas or the 500-year floodplain. So it's important to try to remind them, they're trying to get out of having flood insurance, and then, they're still at risk. So when they are flooded, they don't have that to fall back on, and then they're unable to fully recover or recover quickly. And so we try to encourage people to have a flood insurance policy anyways. Just a few things I put together on LOMAs here. Again, it may not remove the requirement, so just reminding people that their lender might require them to have it anyways, because it would be expensive to go through all of that with the surveying and everything, and then you still have to have an insurance policy if that was your whole goal. Again, map changes can change the status of the letters of map change. So as we go through the mapping process, at some point you'll be given information about how your current letters of map change will be impacted by those mapping changes. And so we had an issue with one of our counties that was mapped recently, with a lot of people getting superseded, so their LOMAs and LOMR-Fs were no longer effective, and they were very upset. And it seems like the floodplain administrator did not notify them until the maps were coming out. So when they're announced, the letter of final determination comes out 6 months before they become effective, and at that point they'll send you the summary of map actions, or the SOMA, with your letter, and that just details each case, each letter, and why they're being either superseded or the other 3 categories, so they can be incorporated, which means they're basically mapped, like they won't be mapped into the new floodplain, so they don't need the LOMA anymore. Not incorporated means the LOMA will be valid still, so basically no impact. Superseded is the important one, where you'd want to work with and speak with property owners as soon as you find out, so that they can plan ahead and be aware of that. Why are they superseded? Either the new base flood elevation is high enough that the lowest adjacent grade or that lowest floor level is going to be below that new base flood elevation. Revised H&H analysis. So just better data shows that they should be mapped into the floodplain. Revised topographic information, or it can be superseded by another letter of map change. So another one has been filed and supersedes that original one. Again, as soon as you find out you'll have some superseded, you want to notify that property owner as soon as possible. The other categories are not too important. And then there's also to be redetermined, which basically means it's typically in that case a LOMA for a large number of properties, multiple lots, stuff like that, so that they have to take a closer look at it and it hasn't been determined at the time that they send out the SOMA. So yeah, lots of stuff to remember here. And people will ask me if they can get a LOMA, how do they get a LOMA? And then they just kind of don't make the connection between you have to qualify for it, like your property or your structure has to be high enough to qualify for it. And so trying to explain that is probably one of the harder parts of dealing with LOMAs, I think. Okay. One last thing here before we launch the first poll question. I just wanted to show you the difference between a LOMA and then a LOMA denial, because they look very similar, and we've had a lot of instances where people got this and didn't realize that it was actually a denial, because they look almost the same. So this is what the LOMA looks like. Again, you can pull these up on the Map Service Center, or we also have a letter of map change viewer, which is similar to the effective floodplain viewer. Basically, we have all of the denials, LOMAs, LOMR-Fs, and LOMRs mapped out So that's a helpful resource if you didn't know about that. Anyways, this says LOMA DEN in the top corner. It says non-removal instead of removal. And then, of course, if you look at the base flood elevation, in this case, it's a couple of tenths of a foot below. So it's just not high enough. And then in the other one, the approved one, you can see that they're equal. So that's why it's approved. Just something to be aware of when you look at LOMAs. People may not realize that it's actually a denied LOMA. Okay. So we have our first poll question. Again, you need to answer both of them to get credit. You don't have to be correct, but you do have to participate, and then we'll take a quick break before we move into section 2. So the question, can a LOMA be issued in the floodway, true or false? So I'll give you guys a few more seconds to get your answers in.
And while we're doing that, if anybody has any questions, feel free to come off mute or enter them in the chat. I've been trying to add some useful content in the chat, but if anyone else has anything else, feel free to ask.
Okay, so someone sent me a direct message that you thought everything had gone to NAVD 88. Yeah, I think I did say that wrong. I apologize. So the NGVD 29 is the old datum. The NAVD 88 is the newer one. So just not everything is in the newer datum yet. I'm sorry for misspeaking on that.
So it looks like we're still having some answers come in, so we'll give it just a few more seconds here. So if you haven't answered that poll and you want credit, please do so now. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end that and share the results.
So yes, a LOMA can be issued in the floodway. So again, it would have to be on natural grade and inadvertently mapped into the floodway. And you would also have to use the MT1 form for that and not the MT easy. So as long as it's on natural grade and it's still at or above the base flood elevation, that would still be approved. You cannot do a LOMR-F in the floodway. That would be the MT2 process, which is much more technical. So yeah, I'll mention that.
No
Go
worries.
ahead.
No worries if you got it wrong. You just have to participate to get the credit. So, but good thing to learn.
Yep. Okay, so why don't we take a 5-minute break here so you can go get a drink or use the bathroom, whatever, and then we'll pick it back up at, I guess, 9:58. Or maybe we'll just start at 10 o'clock. That would probably be easier. Just start at 10 o'clock. Take a quick break. Oh yeah, this stuff may not be popping up on the viewer. We're having some issues with our viewers right now, so when we get those back up online, it should be showing. Okay, it's 10 o'clock, so hopefully everyone is back. And I see we had another question come through. Is the LOMC layer available in ArcGIS Online? I don't think so. Tara, do you know?
So we have our own GIS server, so our layer runs through that. I think you could possibly input the service link into it from ours, or my recommendation would be that FEMA's National Flood Hazard Layer is an ArcGIS Online product. So I could research what the service link is for that, and you can also view the letters of map change using that service in ArcGIS Online. So I can look into that and then post that in the chat when I find it.
Cool, thanks. Okay. So on to the next part, which is letters of map revision based on fill. So in this picture, you can see that this industrial building, this commercial building has been elevated on fill. So that's what that is. That's what it looks like. It's usually pretty obvious if something is on fill. It doesn't look like the surrounding natural grade. So again, the timing on that defines what's fill and what can be considered natural grade if it's placed in the area before it was identified on the flood map or before, yeah, it was mapped in, then it would be considered natural grade. So again, there would have to be some way to prove that if it's been there long enough. So yeah. So again, this is the MT1 application, so it's a little bit more in depth than the MTEZ. A lot of it is the same, though there's a lot of overlap. So again, this would be for LOMAs that are a commercial property, if it's in the floodway, or if it's for multiple properties or lots. So a lot of times when they're putting together a subdivision, they would do all of those LOMAs at the same time if they're on natural grade. So that's what this form would be used for. Again, the MTEZ is only for residential single lots or structures. So on this one, when we start out, it's asking if you're applying for a LOMA, a CLOMA, a LOMR-F, or a CLOMR-F. So the C is for conditional on the CLOMA and CLOMR-F. Basically, it's a letter before you start the project where FEMA says, yes, it will be approved if you build as proposed, and then you do the project, and then you apply for the actual LOMA or LOMR-F. So that's what that's for. It's a good practice to do that, especially for a LOMR-F and CLOMR-F. And then there is a fee associated with the LOMR-F and CLOMR-F, but the LOMR-F is a bit discounted if you did the CLOMR-F first. So just a side note on that. So again, we're mostly talking about the LOMR-F. There's a few things about the CLOMR-F that are specific to that. You could also use the MT1 form for all LOMAs. So we have some surveyors that just use this for all of them so they don't, accidentally use the wrong form. So any LOMA is fine on the MT1. Again, this one is expired. Definitely periodically check the site, or before you start a new one, check the site just to make sure. And I will, make that as widely known as I can if they do update it and get that form. So again, we're not putting fill in the floodway, and this is specifically stated on the form and in the instructions what to not use it for. So anything that would change the base flood elevation. So that's usually like a bigger project, and those bigger projects often require the LOMAR and or the CLOMAR. So that's the letter of map revision, and that's the MT2 application form. So not this one, and we do have a training on that on our website under our recorded training. That one's mostly for engineers. We are working on putting together a non-technical one for floodplain administrators when they're dealing with that. So that's just another side note for stuff we have coming down the pipeline. So nothing like that, no requests that are going to change the floodway boundary delineations or like moving the stream course. Alluvial fan areas, we might have some of those in western Kansas, but not many. Anything where fill is in the floodway, that normally wouldn't be allowed unless you jump through all of the state, federal permitting hoops and then probably have to get the LOMAR or at the very least a no rise in that case, which yeah, would be very technical. That's why it's a different application. So channelization projects, culvert replacements, other flood control stuff. Of course, high hazard coastal areas, but we don't have those. But again, that kind of stuff is the LOMAR process in the MT2 forms. And if anyone comes to you with proposals like this, you would definitely want to stop them and tell them about state permitting and federal permitting and all of the analysis that would have to go into a project like that, which will sometimes deter people from wanting to do it, which is a good thing. So just making sure that you don't have someone going down the wrong path with a project like that with the MT1 form. We're just talking about fill in the floodplain fringe. So that would be the zones that are outside of the floodway. So So for a LOMR-F, often they will need a state permit. So if the fill is on average a foot or more, you would need to reach out to our Manhattan office and go through that permitting process. So, and that's completely separate from FEMA and the NFIP. That's our state laws regarding floodplain fill and obstructions and stuff like that. So if you're interested in state permitting, we do have a recorded training on that in our training page. Oops. Okay. So here's an example. Again, the timing. So they do ask about that, like has fill been placed and then when was it placed? So again, the determination on whether or not it could count as natural grade, but it just helps them reviewing the entire project. So in this example, it's clearly on fill. You can see the ground disturbance. So that makes it pretty obvious if something is on fill. If you're coming across a project that didn't get permits, something like that, this would be helpful. Okay, so the Endangered Species Act has been being pushed by FEMA a lot, and there isn't a whole lot of clear guidance at this point in time. So we are waiting for that. I have them rewriting one of my endangered species articles, so I intend to put out at least a newsletter article in June on that. Hopefully they'll have it done. But basically, if you're doing a LOMR-F, you need documentation of compliance with the Endangered Species Act. And their thought behind that is that if you're doing the LOMR-F, the work has already been done, and they're presuming that the community made sure that it was complied with. So we'll talk a little bit about how you can get that documentation and some of these strange intricacies that are going on right now. So I wish I had better guidance and information for you on that right now, but it's been going through a lot of changes since FEMA has been working through a lot of litigation. They were sued by multiple entities for not enforcing the Endangered Species Act. So they've been putting it on, a lot of their updated forms and other guidance. So for the LOMR-F, we do have to have some kind of documentation of that. And then at the bottom, we could be talking about multiple structures and lots. So again, that's important to keep in mind. Right, so again, if it's a LOMR-F, the community is supposed to ensure that. If it's a CLOMR-F, FEMA wants documentation of it. So I hope I said that clearly. Basically, you could be at fault for harming a species or their habitat in the case of, putting fill in the floodplain. So like riparian areas and stuff like that. It would mostly be in unincorporated, less developed areas where this would be a real concern and might actually impact something, but I will show you some resources on where you can check that. Okay. So again, FEMA was sued by multiple entities, which is why this became kind of a bigger deal. So mostly, again, undeveloped floodplains might contain habitat or rare species. So that could entail doing an incidental take permit if it was. And so they're only concerned with the federal species. There are a separate list of state species that are endangered, so just the federal ones. Yeah, so they've been, again, settling some of the lawsuits, working through them. So the Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks has this list of species. Again, that would include some of the state species as well. And then the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service deals with this. They are the departments for that. So there is a field office in Manhattan that you can contact at the very least to check with them, and then you can keep official correspondence with them as documentation of the Endangered Species Act. So there is another resource, which is IPAC, or the Information for Planning and Consulting, which is a U.S. Fish and Wildlife site that they put together to try to expedite some of these reviews because they were taking a long time. And they have been able to offer this service through that site where you can put together different levels of a package for them to review and have that documentation. But it's not completely clear yet, again, what would be accepted by FEMA through that service, but I just wanted to put it out there. They've done a lot of updates to it. There's a lot of training and resources on there. So if you do run into Endangered Species Act, that might be something that can help. And then hopefully we get some more clarification from FEMA on using that service, what's accepted, and just further guidance on this, because they've been pushing it, but not really giving much guidance, and it's been confusing. So, right. So this is the contact information for the field office in Manhattan. So you can reach out to them just in case you're not sure, or if you are doing the LOMA-F or have a LOMA-F coming through your office, then you can just make sure that this has been documented. Because the LOMA-F, the community has a little bit more responsibility and liability for signing off on those. So the community does have to sign off on the MT1 form, which is not really a concern for a LOMA because they're just taking a section of natural grade out, but now we're altering things. So there's a little bit more that goes into that and compliance, and so we'll get into it. But so if you send them an email, you can attach a map, and they can usually give you a determination that way, or if they need more information, but you'll have that correspondence with them. So they have acknowledged IPAC a little bit, but yeah. So when you do work through state permitting for fill, so again, a foot or more on average would need a state permit. And then we have the Environmental Coordination Act, so it'll go through other state agencies to make sure that everything's in compliance. So that would include Kansas Wildlife and Parks, so it does get checked that way as well if it's required for a state permit. And then this is their website where they have the threatened and endangered species listed by county, so you might be able to look at this and see what species may be impacted by a project. and what might obviously not be impacted, like the Topeka shiner, that's a fish. So if you're, not directly impacting a stream, then, which you wouldn't be in this case, so that gets ruled out. So just another resource that we have. This is the site for the Manhattan field office. So you can contact them through the website as well, I'm sure, and help with that determination. And then this is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife IPAC website. So this has been updated a lot since it came out a couple of years ago. So they have these 3 options here to help them expedite these determinations. So you can explore species and habitat, you can get a regulatory review or a whole consultation package. So like I said, there's a bunch of training videos on there if you're interested in this. And if you have to get a determination, it might help. They said they've saved over 800 years of staff time by using this service. So there is an agreement with FEMA where they have some level of acceptance as an official source or determination on this. So hopefully we'll get better guidance on that, but this is a good resource for you. And then this is just kind of what the letter looks like. So there's another resource. This is the Flood Risk and Endangered Species Habitat, or FRESH map. So this is another resource that you have. You can look at the areas of habitat, and then there's a floodplain overlay feature to it. So you can see where those overlap and potentially where you might have concerns. There's also a new CRS activity to put together this plan and utilize this and better protect species. So if you're a CRS community, that might be interesting to you, or a prospective community. Okay. And then there's a complete checklist here. So they do put these in here to help make sure that you have everything that you need before you submit. So again, the fermet, the plat map or the property deed, the elevation form in this case would be used. So they do have a longer elevation form, so you can add multiple structures or multiple lots. Again, the scale and north arrow need to be in there. The community acknowledgement form, so we'll look at that, but that's where the floodplain administrator needs to sign off on it and make sure it's in compliance with that whole statement. And then it says for LOMA-Fs, the following must be added or submitted in addition to that list, which is the ESA compliance. So some kind of documentation that it's not going to impact species, or the incidental take permit. So yeah, again, at the very least, if you're confused with all of those resources, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Field Office will be able to guide you better through that and what's needed. And then the payment form, so this would have to be filled out for the LOMR-F or the LOMR-F. So $325, whereas a LOMA does not have a fee again. And if you're doing multiple lots or structures or following a LOMR-F, yeah, it's 700 if you're doing all of that. So it can be expensive. So you definitely wouldn't want to submit something that's not going to be approved. And then again, the contact information at the bottom of that. So yeah, okay. Right, don't waste money on a LOMR-F application that won't be accepted. So they did release a new technical bulletin 10 that talks about how to build reasonably safe on filled land. So this is an update from about a year ago. Yeah, a year ago. So that's the first update since like 2001. So this is helpful. They've really expanded it, like they have their other technical bulletin updates. So yeah, if it's not reasonably safe from flooding, it'll be rejected. So at or above the base flood elevation, and then there's other requirements because you're an NFIP participating community that it has to comply with your regulations. So don't sign off on a LOMR-F unless you have the full plans for what's going to be built on it. Because if you sign off for just the fill pad, you're not looking at what that construction is going to be, and people are not going to just construct a fill pad for no reason. They're planning to build something on it. So you need to look at those plans and make sure that it's going to be compliant, even though they are taking it out of the special flood hazard areas. So there is a section in this technical bulletin about buildings with basements. So of course, basements are not allowed in the floodplain. By state law, the lowest floor needs to be at least 1 foot above the base flood elevation. So a lot of people will submit plans to build a fill pad and then dig into that and put in a basement. So that's not compliant. That's definitely going to be at risk and not something that should be done, and definitely not something that you should sign off on. Of course, we do have the residential basement exemption. We only have 10 communities in that program. So if you're not one of those communities, definitely no basements. And then there are other requirements for that if you are. So again, with the intervening higher grade, it doesn't really work for a LOMR-F. What's acceptable for a LOMA is not necessarily acceptable for a LOMR-F. So they're not going to consider intervening higher grade in that case. It needs to be natural. So it does say that in the MT1 guidance. So there is a whole guidance document. So there's instructions, and then there's a whole separate MT1 guidance document that goes even more into how to calculate base flood elevations and other things. So that is a helpful resource if you need that. So yeah, intervening higher grade, not really an option here. And that building would be at risk, and the lowest adjacent grade would be below the base flood elevation, so they're not going to approve it for something that's built on fill. And we have had these mistakes made before, of course, and people signing off on things that they shouldn't, or someone else signing off that's not a community official who shouldn't have been signing. Anyways, just those types of examples with the full basement and stuff like that, it's not going to be approved. So the bottom of the page, it's very straightforward. It's just more of the contact information, and that's the whole first part of that. So we have had other situations where people are trying to get a LOMR-F by putting dirt around the outside of a crawl space, and then applied for a LOMR-F saying that that made it elevated on fill, but the interior of that crawl space floor was below the exterior, and then that made it a basement. So FEMA considers a basement anything that's below grade on all 4 sides. So that became a violation, and that's not going to work. So that's just another example that we've had. So FEMA will notify us about it, and then we reach out to the community and sometimes work with the property owner on correcting violations. So that's another thing to be aware of in this process, is that FEMA will review everything in detail, and if there's a violation, then they're going to let us know about it, and they're going to ask us to deal with the community and get that enforcement. So it can flag violations that you didn't know about. And then we'll contact you, and these can be very difficult to fix. So it's just something to be aware of. You know, if there's a structure that has to be elevated, that's a really tricky situation. And of course, enforcement is to the maximum extent possible, and getting to those harder cases, it could go to court potentially. That's the worst case scenario. We do try to get voluntary compliance, so this can bring up compliance issues for sure, especially if you signed off on it. Yeah, it can be tricky in that way. So something to be aware of, don't sign off on anything that's not compliant or that you haven't been able to review in full. So yeah. So also this still includes the attached deck or garage. That's something else that can be missed. It's everything to do with that fill pad and what goes on it and making sure that each of those structural elements is, again, elevated to or above the base flood elevation. So it's similar to the elevation certificate or the LOMA. We look at those stairs or patios or deck or garage. So the same thing here, this is same NFIP community number that we looked at and how to find those, property name or address. Existing or proposed conditions, again, proposed would be for the conditional letters. So this is pretty straightforward. They're asking for the foundation type again. Again, subsidence or uplift, we have 2 counties that might have subsidence. The elevation datum, same thing. Conversion factor information in here. All of the same things that you would see on the other form. Same thing you would need for a LOMA. And then this is the community status book. So if you type in community status book Kansas, it should bring this up. And then this is just a really easy way to find map information or other information about a community, whether they're in the regular program or emergency program, current map date. So this is a convenient resource for that kind of information. And then the CID is the community ID number on the left side. Yep, existing or proposed. So that's the LOMR-F. And then again, the LOMR-F still has to be filed afterwards to be completed when the project is finished. So again, checking the datums, just a little bit of information on conversions. So it was kind of confusing looking at what software we're on, because it used to be NCAT, which was like the transformation tool, and then that's been retired, and now we're on, I think, VertCon 2 or 3, something like that, but it's software that you can download. Again, mismatched datums will cause issue if we're looking at an older map. So this is just kind of a graph showing the change between the datums as you go east to west. So it could be like 40 centimeters, 60, yeah, up to 40 centimeters, and that would be an issue that's almost 20 inches. So that could be a serious mistake. And we're talking about a LOMR-F, and then, yeah, this is where you can download it. And then the NGS, that's where all the benchmarks are kept track of. So FEMA used to track it, and now they've pushed it onto the National Geodetic Survey. So you can go here, and there's lots of maps that show you where the benchmarks are, when they were placed, what they look like, who's maintaining them, and all of that kind of data. So it's pretty interactive if you need that. The NCAT has been retained for historical context, but they, yeah, it's back to VertCon. So if you need that, you need to look into it and make sure that you have the right version of that software. And then, of course, they want you to attach any conversions that you do for that. So again, the MTEZ is similar. We're looking at the lowest lot elevation and the note at the bottom. The lowest lot elevation for the meets and bounds description. So they would want to probably get the entire fill pad out and then build on top of that. So yeah, it doesn't have to be built yet. You can submit it before the project is complete, as long as the fill pad is complete, of course. And then here's an example of that. So this is a manufactured home that's on top of a fill pad, and then it has a retaining wall built around that, and then they moved it on top. So it was kind of dragged up that ramp. And then they have the attached decker stairs that would have to be at or above the base flood elevation. And so this is what the elevation form looks like. Again, you could use the elevation certificate instead of this form. And I think this picture's in Derby, Kansas. So yeah, all right. And then the community acknowledgement form. So this is one of the important aspects of the LOMR-F that you might not have while you're doing a LOMA. If you're using the MTEZ, if you're using the MT1, they do need the signatures. So you should definitely read all of the instructions on this page and make sure you know what you're signing off on. So the community number, property name or address here, the paperwork burden disclosure notices on every page. So this is the third form. So you will be asked to sign this. And here's what the statement says. So for placement of fill, making sure that the completed or proposed project is in compliance. They have all the state and federal permits that they need, which in this case would most likely need a state permit for floodplain fill. There's no fill being placed in the floodway. That's an important one. Compliance with the Endangered Species Act. So again, you need to check that whether it's a LOMR-F or a CLOMR-F. To make sure that you're not going to violate that, because then the community is liable for it. And then that things are going to be reasonably safe. So yeah, this is all from the CFR, and FEMA acknowledges the bit of a loophole that if people get their LOMR-F, they're technically taken out of the floodplain and they no longer have to comply with floodplain regulations, and then they can kind of just do whatever they want on top of the fill pad. And so that's why I said you should definitely look at what their construction plans are before signing off on it, because if they put a basement and they dig into the fill pad to place that basement and the lowest floor is below the base flood elevation, then it's not reasonably safe from flooding. So even though people have tried to exploit this loophole, that's definitely something to look at. Again, no one's going to build a fill pad just for the sake of doing that and taking it out of the floodplain. They're going to build on top of it. So, we need to take a look at that. So we have had some issues, again, with this, with people putting in a basement. Basements are very popular in this region of the country. So again, if it doesn't meet regulations, don't sign it. You absolutely don't have to sign off on something until you're assured that it's going to be compliant. So basically no basement. We have had people's lawyers try to say that this document is not legally binding. So you might, if that's the case, or, if you're signing off on stuff like this, you might want to put a covenant on the deed for no basements, and that might be more legally binding than just this form. Non-conversion agreements are usually a good idea for certain types of foundations that might have areas that could be converted into living space. So I mean, it would be at or above the base flood elevation, but the thing is, it's supposed to comply with your regulations. That's the important thing. You're not going to catch everything, and people will, do things that they're not supposed to. So, and then once it's taken out of the floodplain, basically they don't have to comply anymore. So, just having those other documents like a non-conversion agreement might help prevent that. You can also adopt a higher standard into your ordinance to include approved LOMR-F properties in your regulations. So we have that model language if you update your ordinance where you can add that in. Lands to which the ordinance applies would include the LOMR-F properties, so that's an option as well. Again, we've had cases where someone else signed the community form and not a community official or the floodplain administrator. So yeah, and reasonably safe means it's not going to be inundated by the base flood. That's the meaning of reasonably safe. So that's where that comes in and why the CFR applies to that. And then, of course, having a basement with the subsurface water and stuff is not reasonably safe. So just putting that out there. Again, it needs to comply. So yes, it has to meet those design standards. So even if it's approved. So this is basically everything I just covered. Again, we have the statewide lowest floor law, and DWR Manhattan, they will remind you of that, and make sure you follow that, because it is a state law and it has to comply with that, even though FEMA is really just concerned with the minimum standards that they have. So there's a little bit of disconnect there. It's kind of on the community to enforce higher standards. But at the very least, the statewide law on the 1 foot of freeboard is there. Okay, yep, that should be all of it. So the community form, it's either current or proposed. Again, we're not interfering with the floodway, at least for putting no fill in the floodway. It could be a LOMA in the floodway. The federal, state, and local permits, if that's required, most likely a state permit. The Endangered Species Act compliance, and then making sure it's reasonably safe. So these are kind of the main things to look out for on the LOMR-F. Yeah, and then the definition for reasonably safe from flooding. Just basically that it's not going to be inundated by the 100-year or 1% annual chance of flood. So again, it's kind of like the case with the crawl space. We had a porch situation. They just basically, again, putting more fill around the foundation. In this case, they had a porch. Again, you can inadvertently create a basement by FEMA standards, and then that will trigger the violation stuff, and then FEMA will let us know about it, and then we have to do all the enforcement stuff. So that's basically how that happens. FEMA will reach out to the region and then us, and then we work with you to investigate and enforce any violations. And of course, if they had reached out to us, we could have helped them through this process a little bit better without this happening. People are just sometimes unaware. And then they inadvertently create a basement situation or something like that that makes it non-compliant. That's right. And then just a little bit more about how that relates to insurance. They're looking at the first floor height. So this is one of the structural characteristics that's used in the rating system. So I showed you the graphic that had all of that other data around it. All the other data sets that they're using instead of just the mapping and the base flood elevation. That is kind of a rating factor. It's just not the only one used anymore. So we have the first floor height, which is the first floor that's above the adjacent grade, is a rating variable now. So just putting this out there, they kind of combined the elevation certificate diagrams and just kind of narrowed it down into a couple of different foundation structures, even though they are a little bit different, like different types of basements and that kind of thing. So just looking at this and then making sure that it's compliant. There's also a discount explanation guide. So this is one of their more recent guidance documents, and it just kind of goes over how first floor height impacts your rating. So they have that separated by the different foundation types. And then they go into mitigation discounts, having flood openings, some of the more statutory discounts that have to do with mapping changes and stuff like that. So if you have questions as this relates to insurance, or if your applicants have questions on insurance, there is A little bit more guidance that's been put out by FEMA in the last year or so as we work through the new risk rating system. And then there's a separate, so on the community forum, there's a separate box for signing off on if it's a LOMA in the floodways. So this is just to acknowledge that it's for a LOMA and that no fill has been put in the regulatory floodway. And so there's just a separate box for that. And then of course the floodway, if you're not super familiar with looking at flood maps, that's the horizontal striping. So it's the cross hatching, and it's represented that way no matter what version of the map you're looking at. So this MSC, it looks, it's kind of like red and blue striped on the National Flood Hazard layer. And then in ours, it's like white cross hatching. So yeah, just definitely check the location before you sign off on everything and make sure that no one's trying to put fill in the floodway. The payment form, so you might want to check this on the FEMA website. Again, don't use postal mail. That's an extra $100. And then make sure you're putting in the right payment, of course, for the letter that you're applying for. And then this is the online portal submission that I talked about earlier. So this is where the surveyors would have an account and then use this to upload applications and their attachments. There have been quite a few issues with this site lately, and people have reached out to me for help with it, but that's kind of, FEMA's, it's a FEMA site, so I don't really work with it or have control over it, but they do have like a number and some other resources for help on that. And then getting to the end here, the 18 US Code Section 1001. Basically, if you falsify information on purpose, it's a crime. So if you knowingly lie to the federal government, then you'd be criminally liable. So usually it's just a mistake and people are not intentionally doing things, but we have had some cases in the past where that may have happened. There is the FEMA independent study course on this, so I'm not sure if they've updated this or not, just I guess related to insurance and things like that and those implications, but we have already covered that. But if you want more in-depth detail on this, it's about a 2-hour class, 157 slides. So you just sign up through the FEMA independent study site and they give you an ID number and then you can take classes. These are worth credit. Not very much. I think it's like 0.3 CECs, but you can take this class. They have other classes on there as well for substantial damage and like elevation certificates and stuff like that. So you might need to look and make sure that they're updated, but you can get some credits there and learn a little bit more. If people reach out to you looking for a surveyor, so this happens to us quite often, we can't recommend any individuals, but we send them to the Society of Land Surveyors just so they can search by county and shop around and find the right person for them. Basically, we would just want them to have some experience maybe doing LOMR-Fs or other letters of map change before. And that's just kind of the advice that we give. So I send people there quite often. We do have a handout on this and just how to shop around a little bit and ask questions. The MT1 instructions will answer most of the questions that you have. Again, there's that and the MT1 guidance that you can look at. So you'd want to read the instructions carefully, and then you might want to familiarize yourself with those instructions if you're not a surveyor. If you're a floodplain administrator that's not too familiar with it, the instructions will help make some more things clear. I think sometimes you might just have to work with it to understand it better. but those are available online, and definitely read through the community form before signing, and definitely get the construction plans before you sign off on it. And then just some final thoughts on this. It is very much like the LOMA, where the insurance implications are that it will remove the mandatory purchase requirement. How they construct things after that is what would determine that rating, and of course the other factors that go into that. And of course they can be superseded, and people might be, even more upset about it being superseded with a new map change because they've, paid to have it constructed in such a way that it wouldn't put them in the floodplain, for concerns regarding, regulations, compliance, and the mandatory purchase requirements. So keeping an eye on that, letting people know if you find out about that is really important, to have as least amount of problems as possible. Again, we just went through this with some very disgruntled property owners, and one of them has had a LOMR-F for the last 10 years, and with the new mapping, it was superseded. But of course, in that situation, they couldn't have known that when they constructed it, but the floodplain administrator should have spoken with them sooner. And then just some more resources here. That's Tara's number at the top. She's our NFIP state coordinator, and I'm the NFIP specialist, so you can reach out to us anytime with questions. I help out with this quite often, so if you are not sure about plans and other things like that, I can help answer those questions. Don Masterson is our Region 7 floodplain specialist, so we work with him quite often. Again, the map service centers where you'll find all of those products that you might need to look at to review these things. The FEMA publications, so if you want hard copies of some of these publications, you can order them through the distribution warehouse of FEMA. If you have questions about benchmark, there's the contact information for the National Geodetic Service. Floodsmart.gov is helpful for property owners, and it answers questions about mitigation and insurance. Hopefully, if you're a surveyor, you can start working with the floodplain manager and get to know each other and have a good working relationship. That's really important to avoiding issues. And then, of course, our site that has upcoming and recorded training, including the new elevation certificate form and violations and more stuff. And of course, we announce more training there. So with that, we can launch our second poll question. Again, if you want credit, you do need to participate in these. Okay, so our next question, new construction for a LOMR-F must comply with the adopted floodplain regulations, true or false? I think we'll give it a few more seconds. Not everyone has answered, but not everyone might want credit, so.
All right, it looks like most people have answered, so I'll go ahead and end that and share the results. And it looks like everybody did a good job with that one.
Yep. So it does have to comply with your regulations, and that's really important. So other than that, oh, Terry, did you have that CEC poll in here? Or
Yes, I will bring that up next. So if you do want the CEC credits, please indicate that with this poll, and then we'll get those sent out to you. So we'll leave this up, and then we can take questions if there are any. I saw one come through in the chat, Cheyenne. I haven't had a, I'm still reading it. Let's see. As far as if someone can be held liable for a culvert under a federal highway getting obstructed and causing a flood. I'm not sure on that. Not to my knowledge. I don't know, Cheyenne, if you have any thoughts on that one.
no,
Right.
gets obstructed. So if they did some kind of obstruction,
Or if
that
it
would,
just, oh, sorry.
or if it's just clogged with debris, that I think that would be different than if they, purposely obstructed it.
Yes.
So that would definitely be a violation, and they would be in trouble with the state. And then probably Janelle Phillips would, she would issue that violation letter as far as the state stuff, and then she would bring, USACE, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, or other federal entities that might be involved in that violation. So I think if it was on purpose, they could. There's a lot of issues with like maintaining culverts, and property owners complaining that the city's not maintaining it. So it would depend. I think I saw something in here about a partial basement. So really any basement, anything that's not where the lowest floor is at or above the base flood elevation, then that would be an issue. So any kind of basement that would have, would be below grade would be an issue. Oh, okay, sorry, Terry, you did
Nope.
answer that
No
one.
worries. No worries. Any other questions?
So do LOMA requests not trigger ESA reviews or inputs? No, because they're not really impacting that grade or anything. It's on natural grade. So and I think we just kind of did something recently where like building a house wouldn't be considered a taking of endangered species, but no, they don't ask for that documentation. And yeah, it's more where the LOMR-F requests come into play, and they're more concerned with fill being in a take, like a take from the either habitat or that species. So, okay. Well, if you guys think of any other questions, you can always reach out by email. I'm happy to help however I can.
All right. Thanks everyone for joining us today, and we will get the recording of this up on our training website.
And then I'll get the certificates out as soon as I can. Okay, thanks.